Want to know why some countries are rich and others are poor? Well, it's simple. Poor countries are poor because people there are lazy. Rich countries work harder. That's just facts. You've heard that before, right? Maybe from an uncle at Thanksgiving. Maybe from a comment section. Maybe from a politician. It's clean, it's simple, it makes sense. And it's complete garbage. Okay, not laziness then. It's culture. Some cultures value education and hard work, others don't. That's why Asia is rising and Africa isn't. Still BS, but we're getting warmer on the BS meter. Fine, geography then. Cold climates make people productive. Hot climates make people not. Closer, but also no. Look, I get it. We want simple answers. We want someone to blame or someone to praise. We want the world to make sense in a tweet. But here's the thing about global inequality. It doesn't fit in a tweet. It doesn't fit in a YouTube short. How? It barely fits in a 2-hour video. But that's exactly why we need to talk about it. Because the simple answers, they're not just wrong. They're dangerous. They let us ignore the actual systems that keep 3 billion people living on less than $2.50 a day. They let us feel superior instead of curious. They let us stay comfortable. So let's do this the real way. No clickbait formulas, no one weird trick to fix global poverty. Just the messy, complicated, uncomfortable truth about why the world looks the way it does. And I'm warning you now, by the end of this, you won't be able to look at a world map the same way again.
Let's start with what we all know. There's a world map in your head right now. Maybe you're picturing it. Maybe you're not, but you know it. North America, rich. Europe, rich. Parts of Asia getting rich fast. Most of Africa, poor. Most of South America, somewhere in between. This is just how it is, right? This is normal. This is the status quo. We've seen this map our entire lives. World news shows it. Video games show it. Every data visualization shows it. But here's the question nobody really asks. Why is this normal? Like, really think about it for a second. Why is Switzerland, a tiny landlocked country with no natural resources, one of the richest places on Earth? Why does Norway, with only 5 million people, have a wealth fund worth over $1 trillion? Why is Japan, a country that was absolutely destroyed in 1945, now richer than nearly every African nation combined? And on the flip side, why is the Democratic Republic of Congo sitting on an estimated $24 trillion worth of minerals, one of the poorest countries on the planet? Why does Nigeria, the largest oil producer in Africa, have 70% of its population living in poverty? It doesn't make sense, at least not with the simple answers we've been given. So let me tell you what I did. I spent 3 months researching this, read books by economists who'd spent their entire lives on this question, watched lectures from people way smarter than me, talked to people from 12 different countries about their actual lived experiences, and even asked AI to roast my understanding so I could fill the gaps. And what I found was this. Every simple answer is wrong, but every simple answer also contains a tiny piece of the truth. So let's start with the oldest simple answer in the book.
In 1997, a professor named Jared Diamond wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but it basically argued this. Geography determined everything. The reason Europe colonized Africa and not the other way around? Geography. The reason some civilizations developed writing and others didn't? Geography. The reason your country is rich or poor today, you guessed it, geography. And when you first hear this argument, it's actually pretty convincing. So let's explore it, because unlike the lazy people theory, this one actually has some evidence behind it.
Think about where the first civilizations emerged. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, northern China. Notice a pattern? They're all near rivers. Big, predictable rivers that flooded regularly and created fertile soil. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the cheat code for early human civilization. You can't just start farming anywhere. You need the right crops, the right soil, the right climate. And here's the thing. Most crops humans eat today were domesticated between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago in very specific places. Wheat, Middle East. Rice, China and Southeast Asia. Corn, Mexico. Potatoes, Peru. Notice what's missing? Sub-Saharan Africa had very few easily domesticatable crops. Australia had almost none. North America had some, but they were spread out across massive distances. And it's not just crops, it's animals. Europe and Asia had cows, pigs, horses, sheep, goats, animals that could be domesticated, bred, and used for food, labor, and transportation. These animals changed everything. They let you farm more land. They let you travel farther. They let you build armies. Africa, most of the big animals there will kill you. Try domesticating a zebra. Go ahead. People have tried for thousands of years. Zebras don't care. They'll kick your teeth in. Try domesticating a hippo, a Cape buffalo, an elephant. Okay, Asia managed elephants, but African elephants? Different story. So right from the start, different regions had different starting resources, and those resources compounded over time.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Jared Diamond points out that the shape of continents mattered too. Eurasia runs east to west. That means similar latitudes, similar climates, similar day lengths. If you domesticated wheat in the Middle East, you could spread it west to Europe or east to China relatively easily. Same climate zone, same growing conditions. But Africa? Africa runs north to south. So does the Americas. That means if you domesticated a crop in one part of the continent, it often couldn't grow in another part because the climate was completely different. You're crossing from tropical to temperate to desert zones. This slowed everything down. The spread of agriculture, the spread of technology, the spread of ideas, all of it moved slower in continents that ran north-south. And faster technological development meant more complex societies. More complex societies meant specialization. Specialization meant innovation. Innovation meant better tools, better weapons, better ships. Which brings us to the dark part of the geography argument. Living close to domesticated animals for thousands of years did something else. It exposed humans to diseases. Smallpox from cows, influenza from pigs and ducks, measles from cattle. Europeans died in huge numbers from these diseases over centuries, but the survivors, they developed immunity. Their children inherited some resistance. After thousands of years, European populations had biological defenses against these diseases. But populations that never lived closely with these animals? No resistance, no immunity, no defense. So when Europeans showed up in the Americas in 1492, they didn't just bring guns and steel, they brought smallpox, measles, and influenza. And those diseases killed an estimated 90% of the indigenous population within a century. 90%. Not because indigenous Americans were weaker, not because they were less advanced, but because they'd never been exposed to these specific pathogens. Their immune systems had no reference point. This was geography determining history in the most brutal way possible. So geography explains everything, right? Case closed? Not even close. Because here's where the geography argument falls apart. If geography determined everything, then the countries that were rich in 1500 should still be rich today. But they're not. In 1500, China and India were the richest regions on Earth. They had the most advanced technology, the biggest cities, the most productive economies. Europe was a backwater, a bunch of warring kingdoms on the edge of the known world. By 1900, completely reversed. If geography determined everything, why did the Middle East, the birthplace of agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy, fall so far behind? If geography determined everything, why is Singapore, a tiny island with no natural resources and a tropical climate, one of the richest countries per capita on Earth?
If geography determined everything, why are North Korea and South Korea, the same geography, the same climate, the same people, so dramatically different in wealth? Geography gave some regions a head start. That's true. But a head start doesn't guarantee you win the race. In fact, sometimes the head start makes you complacent. So if it's not just geography, what else is going on?
And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because the next part of the answer involves choices, human choices, systems that humans built and systems that humans maintain. Geography is easy to accept because nobody's responsible. It's just luck. Bad luck if you're born in a landlocked country with poor soil. Good luck if you're born near a navigable river. But the moment we move past geography, we have to start talking about power. Who had it? How they used it? And who's still benefiting from decisions hundreds of years ago? And that's a harder conversation. But before we go there, let me ask you something. Have you figured out what the deeper problem is yet? I mentioned it at the start. We want simple answers for complex problems. Because here's the thing. Geography is part of the answer, but it's not the answer. And every time someone gives you the answer to why some countries are rich and others aren't, they're either lying to you or they don't understand the question. The real answer is a web, and we've only pulled on one thread so far. Let's kill another simple answer while we're at it. The idea that cold climates make people productive and hot climates make people lazy. You've heard this one. Maybe phrased differently, maybe dressed up in academic language about temperate zones and work ethic, but it's the same idea. And it's wrong, but it's wrong in an interesting way. There is a correlation between temperate climates and economic development. That's true. Most rich countries are in temperate zones, but correlation isn't causation. And if you dig into why that correlation exists, it's not about the weather making people lazy, it's about disease. Tropical regions have more infectious diseases: malaria, yellow fever, dengue, sleeping sickness. These diseases are devastating. They kill people, they weaken economies, they make it harder to build infrastructure. But here's the key question. Why haven't tropical countries just eradicated these diseases like temperate countries eradicated theirs? Because eradication requires resources. It requires medicine, infrastructure, public health systems, and money. Lots of money. Malaria was common in Europe and North America into the 20th century. The United States had malaria in the South until the 1950s. It wasn't eradicated because Americans were more disciplined. It was eradicated because the US government spent massive amounts of money draining swamps, distributing medicine, and building healthcare infrastructure. Poor countries know how to eradicate malaria. They just can't afford to. So the climate argument is backwards. It's not that hot climates make countries poor, it's that poor countries can't afford to solve the problems that hot climates create. See the difference?
Okay, here's another simple answer people love. Natural resources make you rich. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you have oil, diamonds, gold, and minerals, you should be wealthy. That's just logic. Except it's often the opposite. This is called the resource curse, and it's one of the weirdest patterns in economics. Countries with abundant natural resources often end up poorer than countries without them. And not just a little poorer, sometimes dramatically, catastrophically poorer. Let's look at some examples. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, and yet the average Venezuelan has lost 25 pounds in recent years because there isn't enough food. Inflation hit 1,000,000% in 2018. 1,000,000%. Democratic Republic of Congo contains more than half the world's cobalt, essential for batteries, massive copper deposits, diamonds, gold, and coltan, estimated mineral wealth of $24 trillion. Average income? Less than $500 per year. Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer. Oil accounts for 90% of export revenue, and yet 70% of the population lives below the poverty line. Meanwhile, Singapore, no natural resources, has to import even its water, one of the richest countries per capita on Earth. Japan has to import almost all of its oil, gas, and minerals, third largest economy in the world. Switzerland, landlocked, mountainous, no oil, no gas, no precious minerals, richest country in Europe by most measures. What the hell is going on?
Here's what happens when a poor country discovers oil or diamonds. 1. The government gets lazy. Why bother building a diverse economy, investing in education, or developing industries when you can just sell oil? Easy money corrupts long-term thinking. 2. Corruption explodes. When there's a concentrated source of massive wealth, every politician, general, and warlord wants a piece. The fight over resource revenue tears countries apart. 3. The economy becomes distorted. Oil revenues drive up the currency value, which makes other exports uncompetitive. Manufacturing dies. Agriculture dies. Everything depends on oil prices. 4. Outside powers get involved. Countries with resources attract the attention of foreign governments and corporations who want access, and they're willing to support dictators, fund coups, and start wars to get it. 5. The people get nothing. The wealth doesn't spread. It concentrates in the hands of whoever controls the extraction. The rest of the country stays poor. This is the resource curse, and it's not a theory. It's a documented pattern across dozens of countries over decades. So if geography doesn't determine everything, and resources can actually make you poorer, what the hell does make countries rich? Here's what I've learned after 3 months of research. The countries that are rich today aren't rich because of where they are. They're rich because of when they developed and what systems they built. And this is where the story gets really uncomfortable, because the when and the what involve colonialism, slavery, exploitation, and systems that are still running today. The game wasn't just uneven, the game was rigged from the start. And that's what we're going to talk about in Chapter 2. But before we go there, think about this. Why do we want simple answers so badly? Why is it easier to believe hot climates make people lazy than to examine centuries of exploitation? Why is it easier to say they're just corrupt than to ask who benefits from that corruption? The simple answers let us off the hook. They let us believe the world is fair. They let us believe that rich countries earned it and poor countries deserve it. But what if that's not true? What if the uncomfortable truth is that most of global inequality is just luck? Luck of where you were born, luck of when your country developed, luck of whether your ancestors had the right crops and animals, luck of whether a colonial power extracted your wealth or invested in your infrastructure. And if it's mostly luck, what does that mean for us? Hold that thought. We're going to need it. So here's where we are. Geography gave some regions a head start. That's real. But head starts don't guarantee victories. Resources can curse you instead of blessing you. Climate correlations are backwards. Poverty causes vulnerability to disease, not the other way around. So if none of the simple answers work, we need to go deeper. We need to talk about history. Real history, not the clean version they taught you in school, the messy version, the version where decisions made in 1650 still affect who eats today. We need to talk about colonialism. And I know, you're tired of hearing about it. That was hundreds of years ago. Get over it. But what if it wasn't hundreds of years ago? What if the systems built during colonialism never actually ended? What if they just changed names? That's Chapter 2. And I'm warning you now, this is where it gets heavy.
All right, deep breath. This chapter is going to make some people uncomfortable. And if you're already typing, "Not everything is about colonialism" in the comments, I get it. I really do. Because I used to think the same thing.
I used to think that colonialism was this thing that happened a long time ago. And yeah, it was bad, but come on, that was centuries ago. Countries have had time to recover. At some point, you have to move on, right? But here's the thing I learned while researching this, and it completely changed how I see the world. Colonialism didn't just happen and then end. It built systems, and those systems are still running. They're not historical artifacts we read about in textbooks. They're the operating code of the modern global economy. And if you don't understand how those systems were built, you can't understand why 3 billion people are still poor today. So let's do this properly. Let's trace the thread from 1500 to today and see if we can find where the world broke. Or more accurately, where it was broken on purpose. Let's go back to 1500. At this point in history, Europe is not the dominant power, not even close. China has the largest economy in the world. India is right behind it. The Middle East is still the center of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The Ottomans control one of the most powerful empires on Earth. African kingdoms like Mali and Songhai are wealthy beyond European imagination. The Malian king, Mansa Musa, literally crashed the gold market in Cairo because he gave away so much gold during his pilgrimage to Mecca. Europe, meanwhile, is a bunch of feudal kingdoms fighting each other over succession disputes and religious differences. They're technologically behind in many ways, they're geographically isolated, they're not the main character of world history, they're a side quest. But then something changes. And it's not that Europeans suddenly got smarter or worked harder, it's that they got really, really good at violence, specifically organized maritime violence. They developed ships that could cross oceans. They developed cannons that could destroy coastal fortifications. They developed navigation techniques that let them find their way back home. And most importantly, they developed the institutional capacity to fund these expeditions through joint stock companies, banks, and government backing. This combination, ships plus guns plus financing plus ruthlessness, changed everything.
When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't discover a new world. There were already between 50 and 100 million people living in the Americas. They had cities, governments, trade networks, agriculture, art, and astronomy. But Columbus and the conquistadors who followed him had guns, steel swords, horses, and diseases. And they had a very specific economic motivation: extraction. They wanted gold. They wanted silver. They wanted resources they could ship back to Europe to fund wars and pay off debts. So they took it. They enslaved the indigenous populations and forced them to work in mines. When the indigenous people died from disease and overwork, and they died in staggering numbers, the colonizers imported enslaved Africans to replace them. Between 1500 and 1800, European powers extracted an estimated 100,000 tons of gold and silver from the Americas. That wealth didn't stay in the Americas. It flowed to Spain, Portugal, and eventually to the banks of Amsterdam and London. It funded European wars. It built European cities. It capitalized European industries. And the places it came from? They were left with empty mines, devastated populations, and economies structured entirely around extraction. This is the first pattern we need to understand: extraction versus investment. Here's the difference, and it's crucial. When a colonizer sets up an extraction economy, they build the minimum infrastructure needed to get resources out. You build a mine. You build a road from the mine to the port. You build the port. That's it. You don't build schools because educated workers might demand rights. You don't build hospitals because you can just replace sick workers. You don't build independent courts because justice might interfere with profit. You don't develop local industries because that would compete with industries back home. Everything is designed for one purpose: get the resources out as cheaply as possible. Now, contrast that with what economists call settler colonies. These were places where Europeans moved permanently and built societies, places like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
In these places, colonizers built different institutions. They built schools because they wanted their children educated. They built hospitals because they wanted their families healthy. They built courts to protect property rights because they owned property. They built infrastructure, roads, railways, and ports, not just for extraction, but for development. And here's the key. When these countries eventually became independent, they inherited functional institutions. They had educated populations, they had legal systems, they had infrastructure, they had a foundation to build on.
But the extraction colonies, when they became independent, usually in the 1960s after centuries of colonial rule, what did they inherit? They inherited economies designed to export raw materials. They inherited populations that had been deliberately kept uneducated. They inherited borders that made no sense, drawn by colonial administrators in Europe who'd never even visited Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 literally had European powers sitting around a map of Africa with rulers, drawing straight lines and dividing up the continent like a pie. They didn't care about ethnic groups, language boundaries, or historical kingdoms. They cared about resources. So you ended up with countries that threw together rival groups who'd been fighting for centuries, or split up unified peoples across multiple colonial territories. And then, when independence came, Europeans just left. They didn't say, sorry we extracted your wealth for 300 years, here's a functioning economy and educated population to help you get started. They just left. And in some cases, they actively sabotaged things on the way out. When Belgium left the Congo in 1960, there were exactly 16 university-educated Congolese people in a country of 15 million. 16! The Belgians had spent 80 years extracting rubber, ivory, diamonds, and copper. They'd built railways and roads to move those resources, but they deliberately avoided educating the population because educated people might resist exploitation. Let me give you a specific example of how extraction colonialism works, because this pattern repeated across dozens of countries. Let's talk about the Congo under Belgian King Leopold II, because it's one of the most horrifying and clearest examples. In 1885, Leopold convinced other European powers to give him personal ownership of the Congo, not Belgium the country, him personally. The Congo Free State was his private property, an area 76 times the size of Belgium, with millions of people, was owned by one man. And what did he do with it? He extracted rubber. The world was going through an industrial revolution. Rubber was needed for tires, hoses, and machinery, and the Congo had wild rubber vines everywhere. So Leopold's agents forced Congolese people to harvest rubber. They set quotas. If you didn't meet your quota, they'd cut off your hand. Not as punishment for failure, as proof that they'd enforced the quota system. They cut off hands of living people, including children, to terrify others into working harder. They took women and children hostage to force men to harvest rubber. They burned villages that resisted. Conservative estimates say 10 million Congolese people died under Leopold's rule. 10 million. That's half the population. And the wealth from all that rubber? It built monuments in Belgium. It funded Leopold's palaces and mistresses. It capitalized European industry. The Congo got nothing but trauma, death, and an economy entirely structured around extraction.
Now fast forward to 1960. The Congo becomes independent. But what does independence mean when your entire economy is designed to extract resources for someone else's benefit? The physical infrastructure exists to move copper and diamonds from mines to ports, but there's no infrastructure for education, healthcare, or domestic industry. There are almost no educated administrators to run a government. The legal system was designed to protect European property, not Congolese rights. And here's the really insidious part. The mining companies were still foreign-owned. Independence meant the flag changed and you got your own government, but the actual economic structures, those stayed in place. The copper still flowed to Europe. The profits still went to foreign shareholders. The new Congolese government got a small percentage in taxes and royalties, but they had no leverage to demand more because they had no alternative economic base. If they pushed too hard, the mining companies would just bribe the military to do a coup, which is exactly what happened, multiple times.
This is what economists call path dependency. The path your economy is on depends on where it started. And if it started as an extraction colony, breaking out of that path is incredibly difficult. Let's contrast this with a settler colony to really see the difference. Look at the United States. Now, I'm not saying the US didn't do terrible things. The genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Africans are foundational horrors of American history. But from an economic institution perspective, the British colonizers built the kind of infrastructure they wanted for themselves. They built schools. Harvard was founded in 1636. They built legal systems based on English common law, with property rights and contracts. They built roads and ports not just to extract resources, but to support local economies. They developed agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. When the U.S. became independent in 1776, it inherited all of that institutional capacity. It had an educated elite who could run a government. It had legal frameworks. It had infrastructure. It had industries. It could build on that foundation. It wasn't starting from scratch. But a country like Nigeria or Kenya or the Congo, they were starting from scratch in 1960, except it was worse than scratch because the existing structures actively worked against them. And here's where people usually say, okay, but that was 60 years ago. They've had time to build. But have they? Because here's what happened after independence, and this is the part that nobody talks about. The colonial powers left, but the colonial economic structures didn't. They just got rebranded. Instead of direct colonial rule, you got something economists call neo-colonialism. Here's how it worked. Poor countries needed money to build infrastructure, schools, and hospitals. Rich countries and international institutions like the World Bank and IMF said, great, we'll loan you money. But the loans came with conditions. You have to open your markets to foreign competition. You have to privatize state-owned industries. You have to cut government spending. You have to focus on exporting raw materials to earn foreign currency to pay back the loans. Notice something? Those conditions recreated the extraction economy. You're still exporting raw materials, you're still not developing local industries because you can't compete with foreign companies, you're still not investing in your people because you have to cut government spending to meet loan conditions, and now you're also in debt. Massive debt that requires you to keep exporting resources just to make interest payments.
Let me give you a specific example. Ghana and cocoa. Ghana is one of the world's largest cocoa producers. Cocoa is the main ingredient in chocolate. Ghana grows it, harvests it, and exports it as raw cocoa beans. Those beans go to Europe, primarily Switzerland and Belgium, where they're processed into chocolate. The chocolate is then sold for massive profits. Now here's the question. Why doesn't Ghana process the cocoa into chocolate themselves and capture more of the value? Because every time they try, they run into barriers. International trade agreements favor raw material exports, but put tariffs on processed goods. Foreign chocolate companies have such massive economies of scale that Ghanaian companies can't compete. International loans came with conditions that they privatize processing facilities, which were then bought by foreign companies. The entire global system is structured to keep Ghana exporting raw cocoa while the profits from chocolate go elsewhere. This isn't an accident. This is by design, and this pattern repeats across hundreds of products in dozens of countries. Copper from Zambia exported raw, processed elsewhere. Coffee from Ethiopia exported as beans, roasted and branded elsewhere. Coltan from the Congo, mined and exported, turned into electronics elsewhere. The poor countries do the hard, dirty, dangerous work of extraction. The rich countries do the high-value processing, branding, and selling, and the gap in wealth continues to grow. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but why don't these countries just refuse? Why don't they say no to bad loans, no to unfair trade deals, no to foreign companies? And that's a fair question. But here's what happens when they try. In 1953, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh. He wanted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which was controlled by the British. He argued that Iranian oil should benefit Iranians. Seems reasonable, right? The British and Americans organized a coup, overthrew him, and installed a dictator who was friendly to Western oil interests. In 1961, the Congo elected Patrice Lumumba as prime minister. He wanted to take control of Congo's mineral wealth and use it for development. Within months, he was assassinated in a coup supported by Belgium and the CIA. In 1973, Chile elected Salvador Allende, a socialist who wanted to nationalize copper mines. The U.S. supported a military coup that killed him and installed Augusto Pinochet, a dictator who privatized everything and murdered thousands of people. Are you seeing the pattern? Every time a leader in a resource-rich poor country tried to take control of their own resources, Western powers intervened, sometimes with coups, sometimes with assassinations, sometimes with economic sanctions, sometimes with direct military invasion. The message was clear. You can have political independence, but you can't have economic independence. The resources will continue flowing to us, or we will destroy you. And this brings us to one of the most uncomfortable truths about global inequality. The wealth of rich countries is directly connected to the poverty of poor countries. This isn't ancient history. This is ongoing. Right now, today, the Democratic Republic of Congo produces 70% of the world's cobalt. Cobalt is essential for lithium-ion batteries. Your phone has Congolese cobalt in it. Your laptop has it. Electric cars have it. The global green energy transition depends on Congolese cobalt. And who's mining it? Children. There are an estimated 40,000 children working in cobalt mines in the Congo, some as young as 6 years old. They mine by hand in dangerous, unregulated conditions. They're exposed to toxic dust. They die in tunnel collapses. They're paid less than $2 a day. That cobalt is sold to Chinese processing companies who refine it and sell it to companies like Apple, Samsung, Tesla, and Microsoft. Those companies make billions in profits. The Congolese children get $2 a day and lung disease. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I didn't personally colonize anyone. I wasn't alive during slavery. Why should I feel guilty? And you're right, you didn't personally do those things. Neither did I. But here's the thing. This isn't about guilt, it's about understanding. You don't need to feel guilty for systems you didn't create, but you do need to understand how those systems work if you want to understand why the world looks the way it does, and more importantly, if you ever want to change it. Because here's what happens when we refuse to understand history. We repeat it. We support policies that sound good but actually reinforce extraction. We buy products without questioning where they come from. We vote for politicians who promise to protect our interests without asking whose interests are being sacrificed. We perpetuate the system without even realizing it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I didn't personally colonize anyone. I wasn't alive during slavery. Why should I feel guilty? And you're right, you didn't personally do those things. Neither did I. But here's the thing. This isn't about guilt. It's about understanding. You don't need to feel guilty for systems you didn't create, but you do need to understand how those systems work if you want to understand why the world looks the way it does, and more importantly, if you ever want to change it. Because here's what happens when we refuse to understand history. We repeat it. We support policies that sound good but actually reinforce extraction. We buy products without questioning where they come from. We vote for politicians who promise to protect our interests without asking whose interests are being sacrificed. We perpetuate the system without even realizing it.
Let me give you a modern example of how this plays out. There's a big push right now for electric vehicles to fight climate change. Great idea, right? Except, as we just discussed, electric vehicles need cobalt, they need lithium, they need rare earth minerals. Where do those come from? Mostly from poor countries. The Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt, Bolivia and Chile for lithium. China controls most rare earth processing. So the green energy transition, this thing that's supposed to save the planet, is being built on the same extraction model that's kept countries poor for centuries. We're not asking, how can we ensure Bolivian lithium miners are paid fairly? We're asking, how can we get cheaper batteries? We're not asking, how can we eliminate child labor from cobalt supply chains? We're asking, how can we make electric cars affordable? The framework is still extraction. We've just rebranded it as environmentalism. And unless we confront that, we're going to build a green economy on the same foundations of exploitation that built the oil economy. So where does that leave us? We've established that geography gave some regions advantages, but those advantages alone don't explain modern inequality.
We've established that colonialism wasn't just a historical event, it was the construction of extraction systems that still function today. We've established that poor countries aren't poor because they're lazy or stupid or corrupt. They're poor because the entire global economic system is designed to keep them poor. Their resources flow out, profits flow out. Educated people flow out because why stay in a country with no opportunities? And debt flows in, locking them into the same cycle. But here's the question we haven't answered yet. Why do some countries break out of this? Why did South Korea, Singapore, and Botswana manage to develop despite starting poor? Why did China go from one of the poorest countries on Earth to the second largest economy? If the system is rigged, how did they beat it? That's what we're going to explore in Chapter 3, because the answer isn't just about economics, it's about institutions, governance, and the few narrow paths that exist from poverty to prosperity. And some of those paths are closing. But before we get there, I need you to sit with something. Everything I've told you in this chapter is documented history. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are facts you can verify. The extraction economies, the coups, the child miners, the debt traps, all of it is real and ongoing. And the reason most people don't know this isn't because it's hidden. It's because we don't want to know. Because knowing means confronting uncomfortable questions about our own lives. It means asking where your phone came from, where your clothes were made, who picked your coffee. It means recognizing that the global economy isn't a meritocracy where hard work is rewarded. It's a system with winners and losers, and which group you're in was mostly determined before you were born. That's not fair. That's not just, but it is reality, and we can't change reality until we see it clearly. So, now you're seeing it. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? We'll come back to that. For now, let's keep pulling the thread. Chapter 3 is about the countries that escaped, how they did it, and whether that path still exists for anyone else.
Okay, so if the system is rigged, if colonialism built extraction economies that still function today, if the entire global structure keeps poor countries poor, then how did anyone escape? Because some countries did. And I'm not talking about oil-rich Gulf states that got lucky with geology. I'm talking about countries that were genuinely poor, sometimes devastated by war, with no significant natural resources, and yet somehow became rich within a single generation. South Korea in 1960 had a lower GDP per capita than Ghana. Today, South Korea is one of the richest countries on Earth, and Ghana is still struggling. Singapore was a tiny island with no resources, kicked out of Malaysia, given up for dead, and now it has a higher per capita income than the United States. Taiwan was an authoritarian backwater, and now it produces 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors. Botswana was one of the poorest countries in Africa at independence, and now it's upper middle income with functioning democracy. China, China was devastated by civil war, famine, and the Cultural Revolution, and in 1978 had a per capita income lower than most of sub-Saharan Africa, and now it's the second largest economy in the world. These aren't small achievements, these are complete transformations. So what did they do differently? And more importantly, can other countries copy what they did? That's what this chapter is about, the narrow paths from poverty to prosperity. And I'm warning you now, the answer is going to complicate everything we've talked about so far, because it turns out that the countries that succeeded didn't follow the advice that rich countries and international institutions give to poor countries. In fact, they did the exact opposite. Let's start with the most dramatic example, South Korea. In 1953, the Korean War ended. The peninsula was split in two. North Korea went communist with Soviet backing. South Korea went capitalist with American backing. Both were absolutely devastated. Both were agrarian, poor, and war-torn. In 1960, South Korea's GDP per capita was $158. That's not adjusted for inflation, that's actual dollars. People were starving, there was no industry. The main export was human hair for wigs. I'm not making that up. Wigs made from Korean hair were a significant export. South Korea was so poor that international development experts considered it a hopeless case. The World Bank said South Korea would never develop because it had no natural resources, too many people, and no industrial base. They recommended South Korea focus on agriculture and light manufacturing and accept foreign aid indefinitely.
South Korea ignored that advice completely. Instead, the South Korean government, under Park Chung-hee, who took power in a military coup in 1961, decided to do something radical. They decided to build industries from scratch, even industries where they had no natural advantages, no expertise, and no chance of competing with established players. They decided to make steel even though they had no iron ore. They decided to build ships even though they had no shipbuilding tradition. They decided to make electronics even though they had no technology base. And here's the key, they didn't leave this to the free market. The government picked specific industries, picked specific companies to support, gave them loans at below market rates, protected them from foreign competition with tariffs, and demanded results. If you got government support and failed to export, you lost the support. If you succeeded, you got more support to move up the value chain.
This is called industrial policy, and every single rich country used it to develop, even though they now tell poor countries not to. Britain protected its textile industry in the 1700s. The United States had massive tariffs protecting infant industries throughout the 1800s. Alexander Hamilton's entire economic plan was industrial policy. Germany, Japan, France, all of them used state intervention to build industries. But by the 1980s, the international consensus became that industrial policy doesn't work, that free markets are the answer, that governments should get out of the way and let competition determine winners. Except South Korea proved that was nonsense. The Korean government created Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK Group. They didn't emerge from free market competition. They were chosen, funded, protected, and directed by the state. Samsung started as a trading company selling fish and vegetables. The government pushed them into electronics. Hyundai started with construction. The government pushed them into cars and ships. These companies were given loans they couldn't have gotten on the free market. They were protected from foreign competition until they were strong enough to compete. They were given export targets and technology transfer requirements. And it worked. By the 1990s, South Korea was producing cars that competed with Japanese and American brands. They were producing electronics that dominated global markets. They went from exporting wigs to exporting semiconductors in one generation. But here's the crucial question. Why did industrial policy work in South Korea when it failed in so many other countries? Because dozens of countries tried this same strategy. India tried it. Brazil tried it. Argentina tried it. Most of Africa tried it. And for most of them, it led to corruption, inefficiency, and failure. The government-backed companies became bloated monopolies. The protection from foreign competition removed any incentive to improve. The loans became slush funds for politically connected cronies. So what was different about South Korea? The answer is institutions. And this is where we finally get to the real answer to why some countries are rich and others aren't. It's not geography, it's not resources, it's not culture, and it's not even colonialism by itself. It's institutions, the rules, systems, and organizations that determine how a society functions. Let me explain what I mean by institutions, because it's not just governments or laws, it's deeper than that. Institutions are the formal and informal rules that shape human behavior. Property rights are an institution. If you plant a crop, do you own the harvest, or can someone with more power take it? Contract enforcement is an institution. If you make a deal, can you trust it'll be honored, or do you need personal connections and bribes? Courts are institutions. If someone wrongs you, is there impartial justice, or does justice go to whoever has more money or connections? Education systems are institutions. Is quality education available to everyone or only to elites? Corruption norms are institutions. Is corruption the exception or the rule? These institutions determine whether it's worth investing in the future, whether it's worth starting a business, whether it's worth getting an education, whether it's worth innovating. And here's the thing. Institutions are sticky. Once they're established, they're incredibly hard to change because the people who benefit from bad institutions fight to keep them.
South Korea had something that most poor countries didn't: institutions that rewarded performance. Yes, the government picked winners and protected industries, but they also demanded results. If you got government support and failed to meet export targets, you lost the support. The government didn't prop up failing companies forever. They had meritocratic civil service exams, so government positions went to competent people, not just politically connected cronies, at least more than in most developing countries. They invested massively in education, not just for elites, but for everyone, because they knew they couldn't compete on cheap labor forever. By the 1990s, South Korea had higher university enrollment rates than most European countries. They had cultural norms around education, where families would sacrifice everything to send kids to good schools. And critically, they had enough state capacity to actually implement policies. When the government said, "We're building a steel plant," they built the steel plant. They didn't just announce it and then have the money disappear into corruption. There was corruption, don't get me wrong. South Korea wasn't perfect, but there was enough institutional strength to actually execute plans. Contrast this with countries where governments announce development projects, money gets allocated, and then nothing gets built, because every layer of bureaucracy takes a cut until there's nothing left. South Korea had extractive institutions. Under Park Chung-hee, he was a dictator who suppressed democracy, but the institutions were performance-oriented. The question wasn't, are you connected to the right people, but can you deliver results? That's a crucial difference.
Now let's look at Singapore, because it's an even more extreme example. In 1965, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia. It's a tiny island, 280 square miles, no natural resources, not even enough water. They had to import water from Malaysia. The population was ethnically divided between Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities with a history of tension. They were surrounded by larger neighbors who weren't exactly friendly. International experts predicted Singapore would fail within years. Instead, under Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore became one of the richest countries on Earth in one generation. How? Institutions. Lee Kuan Yew was authoritarian. He suppressed political opposition, controlled the press, and ran what was essentially a one-party state. But he also built institutions that were incredibly effective. He made Singapore the least corrupt country in Asia through draconian enforcement. Government officials were paid extremely well to reduce temptation for bribes, and anyone caught taking bribes was prosecuted regardless of connections. He made the education system world-class, teaching in English to access global knowledge and attract international business. He made the legal system transparent and efficient, so contracts were enforced and property rights were protected. Foreign companies could trust that investing in Singapore was safe. He invested in infrastructure, building a port that became one of the busiest in the world, an airport that became a global hub, and housing that gave 90% of Singaporeans home ownership. And here's the key. He made Singapore business-friendly not by eliminating regulations, but by making regulations clear, consistent, and enforced equally. You knew the rules, you knew they wouldn't change arbitrarily, and you knew everyone had to follow them. That predictability is worth more than low taxes or cheap labor. Singapore succeeded because Lee Kuan Yew built inclusive economic institutions within an authoritarian political system. Inclusive economic institutions means opportunities aren't limited to a small elite. Anyone can start a business. Anyone can get educated. Anyone can own property. Success is based on merit and effort, not family connections or ethnicity. This is different from extractive institutions, where a small elite controls resources and opportunities, and everyone else is locked out. Most poor countries have extractive economic institutions, where you need connections to get a business license, where property rights depend on who you know, where the best opportunities go to the president's cousins. Singapore avoided that trap. Yes, it was politically authoritarian, but economically it was inclusive. And that combination, authoritarian political control plus inclusive economic institutions, is actually how most rich countries developed, even if they don't like to admit it. Britain didn't have full democracy until the 20th century, but it had property rights and rule of law for business owners centuries earlier. The United States had slavery and denied women the vote, but white men could own property and enforce contracts. South Korea was a dictatorship during its fastest growth period. Taiwan was under martial law. China is still authoritarian.
Development seems to require strong state capacity and inclusive economic institutions, but democracy can actually come later. That's uncomfortable because we like to think democracy and development go together, but the historical record suggests they don't have to, at least not at first. Now let's talk about Botswana, because it's the exception that proves the rule in Africa. Botswana was a British protectorate that nobody cared about. At independence in 1966, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had 12 kilometers of paved road. 12. The British had invested almost nothing because they thought Botswana had no resources worth extracting. Then, shortly after independence, they discovered diamonds, massive diamond deposits. And this is where the resource curse should have kicked in. Diamonds should have led to corruption, conflict, and poverty like they did in Sierra Leone, Angola, and the DRC. But Botswana avoided the curse. How? Institutions. Botswana got incredibly lucky with its first president, Seretse Khama. He established democratic traditions, property rights, and rule of law from the beginning. When diamonds were discovered, the government negotiated a deal with De Beers, the diamond company, where Botswana would get 50% of revenues, not the typical 10 to 20% that other African countries got. They used diamond revenue to build infrastructure, schools, and healthcare, not to enrich elites. They invested in education, bringing literacy rates from 40% to over 85%. They maintained democratic elections and peaceful transitions of power, unusual in Africa. They had low corruption compared to neighbors, and critically, they had traditional institutions that legitimized the government. Botswana's pre-colonial political system was relatively egalitarian, with checks on chiefly power. When independence came, they adapted those traditions into modern democratic institutions. The population trusted the government because it wasn't seen as foreign or imposed. This social cohesion mattered enormously. In countries with deep ethnic divisions or no shared identity, governments have trouble legitimizing themselves, and people don't trust institutions. But Botswana had relatively homogeneous population and traditions that people respected. So when the government said, "We're investing diamond money in schools," people believed it wasn't just going into Swiss bank accounts.
Botswana shows that resources aren't a curse if you have institutions to manage them. Norway has oil and is incredibly wealthy because they have strong institutions that prevented the oil money from corrupting everything. They put oil revenues in a sovereign wealth fund managed transparently for future generations. Venezuela has more oil than Norway, but terrible institutions, so the oil wealth got stolen by elites. The resource matters less than the institutions managing it. And this is the pattern across every success story. Institutions matter more than anything else. South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Botswana, and even China in its own way, they all built or reformed institutions that rewarded productive behavior. They all invested heavily in education. They all maintained enough state capacity to actually implement policies. They all had governments that, whether democratic or authoritarian, were focused on development rather than just extraction. And they all protected infant industries until they could compete globally, ignoring the free market advice from international institutions. Which brings us to China, and oh boy, is China complicated. In 1978, China was one of the poorest countries on Earth. The Cultural Revolution had destroyed institutions, persecuted intellectuals, and created chaos. Tens of millions had died in famines. The economy was centrally planned and completely dysfunctional. Then Deng Xiaoping took power and said something revolutionary. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. Meaning, ideology doesn't matter, results matter. And he opened China to market reforms while maintaining Communist Party control. This shouldn't have worked. The standard advice from economists was that you need democracy and free markets together. You need to privatize everything, open to foreign competition immediately, and let the market determine outcomes. China did the opposite. They kept land publicly owned. They maintained state-owned enterprises in key industries. They opened slowly, creating special economic zones where capitalism was allowed, while the rest of the country stayed under state control. They required foreign companies to partner with Chinese companies and transfer technology.
They manipulated their currency to make exports cheaper. They protected domestic industries with regulations that kept foreign competitors out. They invested massively in infrastructure, building entire cities whether there was immediate demand or not, and they focused obsessively on education, going from 40% literacy in 1978 to near universal literacy today, and producing more STEM graduates than any other country. None of this followed the free market playbook, and it worked spectacularly. China went from making cheap toys to making everything. They moved from low-value manufacturing to high-tech. They built the world's fastest trains, longest bridges, and most advanced 5G networks. They lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years, the fastest poverty reduction in human history. But here's what makes China's success complicated. They succeeded by having strong state capacity and long-term planning that democracy sometimes struggles with. Democratic governments have to win elections every few years, so they focus on short-term results. China's Communist Party doesn't face elections, so they can plan for decades. They can say, we're building infrastructure that won't pay off for 20 years, and actually do it without worrying about voters punishing them. They can suppress wages to keep exports competitive without unions fighting back. They can relocate millions of people for development projects without protests stopping them. This is deeply uncomfortable because it suggests authoritarianism might be better for development than democracy. And I don't think that's true as a general rule, but it's true that development requires state capacity, the ability to actually implement plans, and democracies don't automatically have that. India is democratic and has struggled with development because the state capacity is weak. Everything gets bogged down in bureaucracy, courts, and competing interests. China is authoritarian and developed rapidly because when the government decides something, it happens. That doesn't mean authoritarianism is good. Chinese people paid enormous costs in freedom, repression, and human rights. But it does mean that development is more complicated than just have democracy and free markets.
So what do all these success stories have in common? Let me pull the threads together. First, they all had strong state capacity. The government could actually implement policies, not just announce them. Second, they all invested massively in education, not just for elites, but for broad populations. Third, they all used industrial policy to build industries, protecting them from foreign competition until they could compete. Fourth, they all defied international advice to just open their markets and let the free market work. Fifth, they all had institutions that rewarded performance over connections, at least more than their peers. And sixth, and this is crucial, they all did this before the rules changed. Because here's the thing, the path that South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China took is much harder now than it was then. The global economic rules have changed in ways that close off those strategies. In the 1960s and 70s, when South Korea was using tariffs to protect infant industries, that was allowed under international trade rules. Now, the World Trade Organization has rules against exactly those kinds of tariffs. If you join the WTO, which poor countries are pressured to do, you have to open your markets to foreign competition. You can't protect infant industries the way South Korea did. In the 1980s and 90s, when China was requiring technology transfer from foreign companies, that was questionable but tolerated because everyone wanted access to China's market. Now, that's considered unfair trade practice, and countries face retaliation for doing it. The international institutions created after World War II, the World Bank, IMF, and WTO, were designed by rich countries to benefit rich countries, and the rules they enforce make it much harder for poor countries to use the strategies that rich countries use to develop. It's like rich countries climbed the ladder of development using protectionism and industrial policy, and then kicked the ladder away so nobody else could follow. And it gets worse. Rich countries subsidize their own industries massively. The United States subsidizes agriculture so heavily that American corn and wheat are cheaper than locally grown crops in Africa. Those subsidies destroy African farmers' ability to compete in their own markets.
European countries subsidize their industries through state aid and defense contracts, but when poor countries try to subsidize industries, they're told that's market distortion. The IMF and World Bank loan conditions explicitly forbid it. So rich countries can protect and subsidize their industries, but poor countries can't. That's not a level playing field. That's a rigged game. And this is why, even though we have more development knowledge now than ever, even though we know what worked for South Korea and Singapore, most poor countries can't replicate it. The path is blocked by international rules, loan conditions, and trade agreements that rich countries designed.
Let me give you a specific example of how this plays out. In the 1990s, Zambia had a textile industry. It wasn't huge, but it employed thousands of people and produced clothes for the local market. Then, as part of World Bank loan conditions, Zambia had to eliminate tariffs on imported clothes. Suddenly, cheap, used clothes from America and Europe flooded the market. These weren't just cheaper than Zambian clothes, they were so cheap that Zambian factories couldn't compete even on labor costs. Why? Because the clothes were donations. Americans donate old clothes to charity. Those charities sell them to exporters. Exporters ship them to Africa and sell them for almost nothing because they got them for free. This destroyed Zambia's textile industry. Factories closed, thousands lost jobs, and Zambia became dependent on imported used clothes. Now, wearing used American clothes isn't the worst thing, but here's the problem. Zambia lost the opportunity to develop a textile industry that could have moved up the value chain. They could have gone from basic clothes to higher quality garments, to eventually fashion design and export. That's the path Bangladesh took, going from nothing to a $40 billion garment export industry. But Zambia can't do that now because the industry is dead. And this pattern repeated across dozens of industries in dozens of countries. Loan conditions forced them to open markets before domestic industries were ready. Foreign competition destroyed local industries, and now they're locked into importing everything. So here's where we are. Some countries escaped poverty, but they did it by ignoring the advice that international institutions now enforce. They used strategies that are no longer allowed under current global trade rules. They developed when there was more policy space to experiment. And critically, they had strong institutions and state capacity that most poor countries don't have. Which raises the question, can anyone else follow that path now? Or has the door closed? And if the door is closed, what does that mean for the 3 billion people still living in poverty? Are they just stuck? Is global inequality permanent? That's the crisis we're approaching, and it's the question that's going to define the 21st century. Because if people believe there's no path from poverty to prosperity, if they believe the game is rigged and there's no way to win, then why would they keep playing by the rules? Why wouldn't they tear the whole system down? But before we get to that crisis, there's one more layer we need to understand. We've talked about institutions mattering more than anything, but we haven't really asked, why do some countries have good institutions and others don't? Is it random? Is it culture? Is it history? Because if good institutions are the answer, but we can't explain where good institutions come from, then we're just pushing the mystery back one level. So that's what Chapter 4 is about. Why institutions differ, where they come from, and why they're so hard to change. And I'm warning you now, the answer is going to take us back to colonialism, back to geography, back to everything we've already discussed. Because it turns out all these factors interact in ways that create vicious cycles for some countries and virtuous cycles for others. And once you're in a vicious cycle, escaping is incredibly difficult. That's the crisis moment we're building toward. The recognition that for many countries, the odds are stacked so high that even doing everything right might not be enough. And that's when we have to confront the real question. If the system is broken, what do we actually do about it?
All right, we've established that institutions are the answer. Countries with good institutions get rich. Countries with bad institutions stay poor. South Korea had institutions that rewarded performance. Singapore built transparent, efficient systems. Botswana had legitimate governance. China had state capacity. That all makes sense. But here's the question that's been bothering me through this entire research process. The question that kept me up at night. The question that makes this whole thing feel almost hopeless.
If we know institutions are the answer, why don't poor countries just build better institutions? I mean, it's not a secret anymore. There are thousands of books, papers, and consultants explaining exactly what good institutions look like. The World Bank literally sends advisors to poor countries to help them reform institutions. Universities train government officials in best practices. International donors spend billions on institutional development. And yet, decades later, most poor countries still have terrible institutions. Corruption is still rampant. Property rights are still unclear. Courts are still biased. Regulations are still arbitrary. Why? If everyone knows the answer, why can't anyone implement it? And that's what this chapter is about, the part of the story where everything we've learned so far collides into a deeply uncomfortable realization. Institutions are incredibly, brutally, devastatingly hard to change because the people who benefit from bad institutions have all the power to prevent reform, and the systems that create bad institutions are self-reinforcing, and the historical roots go so deep that even well-meaning reform efforts often fail. This is the crisis moment, the point where you realize just how stuck the world actually is. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're the new president of a poor country. Congratulations, you ran on an anti-corruption platform, you genuinely want to improve your country. You know that you need better institutions, property rights, rule of law, less corruption, better education. You've read all the development economics books. You know exactly what to do. So you start implementing reforms. You announce that government contracts will now go to the lowest qualified bidder, not to politically connected cronies. You announce that judges will be independent and can't be bribed or pressured. You announce that tax revenue will be spent on infrastructure and schools, not stolen by officials. You announce civil service reform so government jobs go to competent people, not party loyalists. These are all good policies. This is exactly what development experts recommend. So what happens? Within months, you're facing a crisis. The political elites who got rich from the old corrupt system are furious because you're cutting off their income. They start plotting against you. The military generals who profited from inflated defense contracts are angry. They start making ominous statements about stability. The business owners who got sweetheart deals through bribes are upset. They start funding your opposition. The judges you're trying to make independent are nervous because they got their positions through political connections and now you're threatening their jobs. The civil servants you're trying to replace are the ones who actually run the government, and they're sabotaging your reforms because merit-based hiring means they might lose their positions. Your own political party is splitting because many of them joined politics to get rich, not to serve the public, and your reforms threaten their business model. The opposition is attacking you not for doing the wrong thing, but for doing it too fast, for destabilizing the system, for being naive about how things really work.
And then the international pressure starts. The IMF says your reforms are good, but you need to also cut government spending and open markets to foreign competition. Foreign investors are nervous about political instability and pull out their money. Your currency crashes. Inflation spikes. People who supported you are now suffering because prices are rising and jobs are disappearing. The media, which is owned by the same business elites you're fighting, starts running stories about how your reforms are destroying the economy. Protests start. Some are genuine, people are actually suffering. Some are astroturfed, paid for by elites who want you gone. And then, late one night, a delegation of military officers visits your presidential palace. They're very polite, they call you Mr. President, but they make it very clear that if you keep pushing these reforms, they can't guarantee your safety. Maybe there's a coup. Maybe there's an assassination. Maybe you just wake up one morning to find your bank accounts frozen and corruption charges filed against you by a prosecutor who's obviously been paid off. Or maybe, if you're lucky, you just get voted out in the next election because people are tired of instability and economic pain, even if that pain is necessary for long-term improvement. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is what happens to reformers in poor countries all the time. They come in with good intentions and knowledge of what needs to change, and they get destroyed by the system they're trying to fix. Let me give you real examples.
Thomas Sankara became president of Burkina Faso in 1983. He was brilliant, charismatic, and genuinely committed to development. He fought corruption, reduced government salaries, starting with his own, sold off the government's fleet of Mercedes and made the cheapest car available the official service car, vaccinated millions of children, planted millions of trees to fight desertification, promoted women's rights, and banned female genital mutilation. He made enemies of everyone. The old elites hated him. France hated him because he opposed French neo-colonial influence. Even other African leaders hated him because he made them look bad. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup led by his former friend, backed by France. He was 37 years old. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the independent Congo, wanted to use Congo's resources for development instead of letting them be extracted by foreign companies. Assassinated within months, with Belgian and American support. Salvador Allende in Chile, democratically elected, wanted to nationalize copper mines and use the revenue for social programs. Overthrown and killed in a CIA-backed coup. Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran wanted to nationalize oil. Overthrown in a coup. These weren't corrupt dictators. These were reformers trying to build better institutions, and they were all destroyed because better institutions threatened powerful interests.
Now you might say, okay, but those were during the Cold War when superpowers were intervening everywhere. What about now? Well, it's more subtle now, but the dynamic is the same. Reformers in poor countries face impossible obstacles. Let me walk you through the institutional trap, the catch-22 that keeps countries stuck. To build good institutions, you need rule of law, property rights, independent courts, and low corruption. But to create those things, you need political will and state capacity. Political will means leaders who prioritize long-term development over short-term personal gain. State capacity means a functioning bureaucracy that can implement policies. But here's the trap. In countries with bad institutions, the political system selects for corrupt leaders because honest people can't win elections when elections are bought. And even if an honest leader somehow wins, they can't implement reforms because the bureaucracy is full of people who benefit from the current system and will sabotage changes. So bad institutions create political systems that prevent the emergence of leaders who could fix institutions, and they create bureaucracies that resist institutional reform. You're trapped. It's like trying to fix a car while the car is driving off a cliff. You need to stop the car to fix it, but you can't stop the car because the brakes are what's broken. Let me give you a specific example of how this works in practice. Imagine you're a talented, educated person in a poor country with terrible institutions. You could try to work for the government and reform it from within, but government jobs pay terribly, like barely enough to survive, because the official salary is based on the assumption that you'll supplement it with bribes. If you refuse to take bribes, you can't afford to live. Your colleagues will think you're weird or a threat. Your boss will pressure you to participate in corruption because your honesty makes everyone else look bad. You'll get terrible assignments, no promotions, and constant harassment. Most honest people can't sustain that, so they quit, which means the bureaucracy becomes more corrupt because you've selected out the honest people. Or you could go into business. But in an economy with bad institutions, you can't succeed as an honest business person. Your competitors are bribing officials for licenses, contracts, and permits. If you don't bribe, you don't get the license. You don't get the contract. You lose to competitors. So honest business people either fail and go bankrupt, or they learn to play the corruption game, or they leave the country. Brain drain, where the most talented people emigrate to countries with better institutions, which makes the original country even worse off because now you've lost your most capable people. Do you see the vicious cycle? Bad institutions drive out good people. The absence of good people makes institutions worse. Worse institutions drive out more good people, and the cycle accelerates.
Now contrast that with a virtuous cycle in a country with good institutions. You're talented and educated, you join the government. The salary is decent, not amazing, but livable because there's less need for supplemental bribes. Your colleagues are generally competent because the hiring system is merit-based. If you do good work, you get promoted based on performance. There are oversight systems that catch corruption, so taking bribes is risky. You can have a satisfying career serving the public. Or you go into business. You can succeed through hard work and innovation because contracts are enforced, property rights are protected, and you don't need political connections. Competition is based on quality and price, not on who you know. Banks will lend to you based on your business plan, not your family name. Talented people stay in the country because there are opportunities. Their success creates more opportunities. Tax revenue from successful businesses funds better infrastructure and education. Better education produces more talented people, and the cycle reinforces itself. Good institutions attract and retain good people. Good people strengthen institutions. Better institutions create more opportunities. More opportunities attract more good people. The gap between countries in a vicious cycle and countries in a virtuous cycle grows wider every year. So where do institutions come from in the first place? Why do some countries start with good institutions and others with bad? And this is where everything we've discussed, geography, colonialism, resources, all of it comes together. There's a concept in political science called critical junctures, moments when historical paths diverge and set countries on different trajectories. The most important critical juncture for most countries was colonialism, or the lack of it. And here's where we get to one of the most disturbing patterns in development economics. The countries that were heavily colonized with extraction institutions are still poor. The countries that were lightly colonized or colonized with settler institutions are generally rich. And the countries that were never colonized are a mixed bag depending on their pre-colonial institutions. Let me explain this with specific examples, because the pattern is shockingly consistent. When European colonizers arrived in a region, they made decisions based on two factors: how many people already lived there and how deadly the disease environment was. If a region had low population density and low disease burden, Europeans settled there permanently. They brought their families, built communities, and created institutions to protect themselves: property rights, courts, and representative governments, at least for themselves. These became the settler colonies: United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and Chile. When these countries gained independence, they inherited functional institutions. They were already rich or became rich relatively quickly.
But if a region had high population density and high disease burden, Europeans didn't settle. They couldn't settle because they'd die from malaria, yellow fever, or other tropical diseases. So instead, they set up extraction systems. They forced local populations to mine silver, grow cash crops, or harvest rubber. They built minimal institutions, just enough to maintain control and extract resources. No schools, no hospitals, no courts that served the local population. Just extraction. These colonies, most of Africa, parts of South Asia, parts of Latin America, inherited terrible institutions at independence. And here's the really insidious part. The extraction institutions were designed to concentrate power in a small elite. When independence came, the colonial administrators left, but the institutional structure remained, and local elites simply stepped into the roles that colonial administrators had occupied. They inherited systems designed for extraction, and they kept using them for extraction. The only difference was that now the extractors were local instead of foreign. The structure didn't change. So post-colonial corruption isn't a failure of culture or character. It's a rational response to institutions designed for extraction. If the system is set up so that controlling the government means controlling resource wealth, then of course people will fight to control the government. If there are no checks on presidential power because colonial governors had unchecked power, then of course presidents will abuse that power. The institutions created during colonialism shaped the incentives that produce corruption today. Let me give you a specific comparison that illustrates this perfectly. In the 1600s, the British colonized both North America and the Caribbean. In North America, specifically in places like Massachusetts and Virginia, disease burden was relatively low, and there weren't massive gold or silver deposits to extract, at least not initially. So British settlers came, brought families, and built communities. They created town councils, property rights, and eventually demanded representation in government. No taxation without representation and all that. These institutions, designed by settlers to protect themselves, became the foundation of American democracy and economic development. But in the Caribbean, Barbados and Jamaica specifically, the British found that sugar was incredibly profitable. But sugar plantations required massive labor, and the work was brutal.
So they didn't bring families and settle. They brought enslaved Africans, worked them to death, and shipped sugar back to Britain. The institutions they created were designed to maintain control over an enslaved majority. Brutal police forces, no rights for the majority, all power concentrated in the hands of a tiny planter elite. When slavery ended, the institutional structure remained. A small elite controlled politics and economics, the majority had few rights and no real representation. Those institutions persist today. Jamaica and Barbados are still struggling with inequality and limited development compared to the United States and Canada, even though they were all colonized by the same country at roughly the same time. The difference was the institutions built during colonization.
And this pattern repeats globally. Darn Acemoglu and James Robinson, economists who studied this extensively, found that regions that were relatively rich in 1500 are generally poor today, and regions that were poor in 1500 are generally rich today. Why? Because colonizers extracted from rich regions and settled in poor regions. The Aztec and Inca empires were wealthy, so Spanish conquistadors conquered them and set up extraction institutions. Those regions, now Mexico and Peru, are middle income but far poorer than North America, which had less wealth to extract, so Europeans settled there. India was wealthy in 1500, one of the richest regions on Earth. The British colonized it and set up extraction institutions. India is still much poorer than Britain today. The reversal of fortune isn't random. It's directly linked to the type of institutions colonizers built, and those institutions persist because they're self-reinforcing. Once you have extractive institutions, the people who benefit from them fight to maintain them. Once you have inclusive institutions, they tend to strengthen over time as more people benefit and defend them. Now, there are exceptions. Some countries that were never colonized developed terrible institutions anyway. Afghanistan, Nepal, Liberia, Ethiopia, and Thailand were never colonized, at least not in the traditional sense. Some are poor, some are middle income. Why? Because institutions can develop badly even without colonialism, if geography, ethnic divisions, or historical conflicts create extractive power structures. Ethiopia had feudalism and an extractive monarchy for centuries. Afghanistan has ethnic fragmentation and geography that makes central control nearly impossible. So institutions can be bad for lots of reasons, but colonialism is the most common cause globally. And there are exceptions in the other direction. South Korea and Taiwan were colonized by Japan, which actually built some infrastructure and education because Japan intended to integrate these territories into the Japanese Empire, not just extract from them. When Japan lost World War II and these territories gained independence, they inherited better institutions than most colonies. So even within colonialism, the type of colonialism mattered enormously. But here's what makes institutional change so brutally difficult. Institutions create constituencies, people whose wealth, power, and identity are tied to existing institutions, and those people resist change with everything they have. Let me give you a modern example. Many African countries have terrible land tenure systems. Property rights are unclear. You might farm land for generations, but you don't officially own it because the government technically owns all land, a holdover from colonial systems where the colonial government claimed ownership. This creates massive problems. You can't use land as collateral for loans because you don't officially own it. Someone with political connections can claim your land, and there's no clear legal process to fight it. This insecurity discourages long-term investment. If someone might take your land next year, why build a permanent structure or plant trees that take years to produce? So everyone knows that land reform, creating clear property rights, would massively improve agricultural productivity and investment. Economists have been saying this for decades, but land reform doesn't happen in most countries. Why? Because unclear property rights benefit people with political power. They can claim land whenever they want. They can extract bribes from people seeking land security. Local chiefs or party officials control land allocation, which gives them power over people who need land. If you formalize property rights and give people clear ownership, you eliminate that power and that corruption income. So the people who have the power to reform the system are the same people who benefit from the current system. They're not going to reform it.
This is called the commitment problem in political economy. Even if a leader promises to reform institutions, how can people trust that promise? Once the leader has power, they have every incentive to break the promise and use extractive institutions to enrich themselves.
And because everyone knows this, it's very hard to build coalitions for reform. The people who would benefit from better institutions don't trust that reforms will actually happen or stick. The people who benefit from bad institutions fight reforms, and the reformers themselves, even if they are initially honest, face enormous pressure and temptation to abandon reforms once they're in power. Think about it from a reformer's perspective. You fight your way to the presidency promising to end corruption. You win. Now you're in office. You control the treasury. You could take a little bit for yourself. Nobody would know. You could give contracts to your supporters. They did help you win, after all. You could appoint your family to positions. They're loyal, at least. The system makes it so easy, and everyone around you is doing it. And if you don't reward your supporters, they'll abandon you for someone who will. And you need them because you have enemies, the old corrupt elite, who are trying to undercut you. So maybe you tell yourself, I'll just be a little corrupt to maintain power, and once I'm secure, I'll implement real reforms. But that moment never comes, because there's always another threat, always another election, always another reason to compromise principles, and before you know it, you've become exactly what you fought against. This is why so many revolutionary movements that promise to end corruption end up being just as corrupt as what they replaced. The institutions create the incentives, and unless you change the institutions themselves, the incentives remain the same regardless of who's in charge. But changing institutions requires power, and the people with power are the ones benefiting from current institutions. It's a trap with no obvious exit, and this is the crisis moment I've been building toward, the point where you realize that everything is connected in a self-reinforcing system that resists change. Geography influenced where colonizers settled versus extracted. Colonial institutions created extractive political systems. Extractive political systems select for corrupt leaders. Corrupt leaders maintain extractive institutions. Bad institutions drive out good people. Brain drain weakens state capacity. Weak state capacity prevents institutional reform. And the cycle continues generation after generation. Countries that got lucky and ended up in a virtuous cycle keep getting richer. Countries that got unlucky and ended up in a vicious cycle keep getting poorer, or at best they stagnate, and the gap between them grows wider. Now let me make this even more depressing. Even when countries try to reform, even when they get international support, even when they adopt all the right policies on paper, reforms often fail because institutions are more than just formal rules. There's a concept called isomorphic mimicry that describes this phenomenon. Poor countries copy the institutional forms of rich countries without the substance. They create anti-corruption agencies that look like the ones in rich countries. They write laws protecting property rights. They establish independent courts. On paper, everything looks great. International donors are satisfied. But in practice, nothing changes. The anti-corruption agency has no real power and doesn't prosecute anyone important. The property rights laws aren't enforced. The courts are independent on paper, but judges are still pressured or bribed. It's like putting up a facade of a building without any structure behind it. It looks right from the outside, but there's nothing there. Why does this happen? Because reformers face international pressure to show progress. Donors want to see that their aid money is creating change, so governments create the appearance of reform without the substance, because actual reform would threaten powerful interests, but fake reform satisfies international donors and maintains access to aid money. Everyone pretends the reforms are real, donors get to report success, governments get to keep aid flowing, and nothing actually changes for ordinary people.
Let me give you a concrete example. In the 1990s, there was a big push for judicial reform in Latin America. International donors spent hundreds of millions of dollars helping countries rewrite laws, train judges, and build new courthouses. On paper, these reforms were comprehensive: new legal codes, new procedures, new institutions. And yet, studies found that in many countries, corruption in the court system didn't decrease at all. In some places, it got worse. Why? Because the reforms didn't change the underlying incentives. Judges were still politically appointed. Their salaries were still low, creating incentives for bribes. The people bringing cases to court were still the same elites who benefited from biased decisions, so judges learned to use the new legal codes to justify the same old biased decisions. The form changed, but the function remained the same. This is why development is so hard.
You can't just copy and paste institutions from rich countries to poor countries and expect them to work. Institutions are embedded in social, political, and economic contexts. They're supported by norms, expectations, and power structures. And unless you change those deeper structures, surface-level reforms don't stick. So where does that leave us? I've spent 4 chapters explaining why some countries are rich and others aren't. We've gone from geography to colonialism to institutions to the vicious cycles that prevent change. And the honest answer is, most poor countries are stuck. They're stuck because of decisions made centuries ago that created institutions that are incredibly resistant to change. They're stuck because the global economic system reinforces extraction rather than development. They're stuck because even well-intentioned reforms face overwhelming obstacles from entrenched interests. They're stuck because brain drain takes their best people. They're stuck because international rules prevent them from using the development strategies that worked for countries that are now rich. And they're stuck because the richer countries get, the harder it is for poor countries to catch up. Technology is widening gaps, not closing them. Artificial intelligence, automation, and advanced manufacturing favor countries with educated populations and capital, which poor countries don't have. The jobs that let previous countries develop, simple manufacturing, are being automated away. The path from agriculture to manufacturing to services, the path that South Korea and China took, might not exist for the next generation of poor countries. This is the crisis. This is the lowest point of the journey. The recognition that the problem is so vast, so systemic, so deeply rooted in history and power structures that there's no simple solution, no 5-step plan, no secret formula. The game was rigged before anyone alive today was born, and the rigging is self-reinforcing. And at this point, you might be thinking, why did I watch this video? This is incredibly depressing. Is there any hope at all? And that's the right question, because we can't stay in the crisis. Understanding the depth of the problem is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need to know what, if anything, can actually be done. And that's what the final chapter is about. Not easy answers because there aren't any. Not simple solutions because they don't exist, but real, difficult, complicated possibilities for change. Some things that have worked, some things that might work, and most importantly, what it actually means for us, for you watching this, to live in a world structured by these systems. Because the deepest question isn't just why are some countries rich and others poor? The deepest question is what does it mean to live in a world where your life chances are determined mostly by where you happen to be born, where billions of people are poor not because of anything they did wrong, but because of historical accidents and systems designed centuries ago, where the comfortable lives that some of us live depend on cheap labor and resources extracted from people with no other options. And what, if anything, are we willing to do about it?
That's the deeper problem I mentioned at the very beginning. We want simple answers because complex truths require us to confront uncomfortable realities about our own lives, about how our prosperity connects to someone else's poverty, about how the systems we benefit from are the same systems that trap others, about how just working harder is an insult to people in countries where the deck is stacked against them before they're even born. And confronting that means we can't just watch this video, feel informed, and move on with our lives unchanged. It means something has to change. Maybe in policy, maybe in how we spend our money, maybe in what we demand from our governments, maybe just in how we see the world and other people in it. But something has to change because now you know. You can't unknow this. The map in your head isn't just geography anymore. It's history, power, extraction, and institutional traps. And that knowledge demands something from you. But what? What can one person do about systems this big? What can even countries do when they're trapped in vicious cycles? Is there any hope at all, or are we just stuck with a fundamentally unjust world forever? Chapter 5 is about that question. Not the answer, because I don't have the answer, but the possibilities, the difficult, complicated, uncertain possibilities, and the choice that we all face about what kind of world we want to live in and what we're willing to sacrifice to get there. That's where we're going, and I'm not going to lie to you and say it ends with hope and inspiration, because I don't know if it does. But we've come this far, we might as well see it through. So here we are, 4 chapters deep,
You've spent almost 2 hours with me going through geography, colonialism, institutions, and vicious cycles. You understand now that global inequality isn't random. It's not about who works harder or who's smarter or who has better culture. It's about systems built over centuries that concentrate wealth in some places and extract it from others. It's about institutions that create virtuous cycles for some countries and vicious cycles for others. It's about path dependency, where your starting point determines your trajectory. It's about a global economic structure that makes it incredibly difficult for poor countries to develop using the strategies that worked for countries that are now rich. And if you stuck with me this far, you're probably feeling some combination of informed, depressed, angry, and helpless. Maybe you're thinking, okay, I get it, the world is broken, but what the hell am I supposed to do about it? And that's the right question. That's the question that matters, because understanding without action is just sophisticated despair. So this chapter isn't about easy answers or inspiring platitudes. I'm not going to tell you that if we all just buy fair trade coffee, everything will be fine. I'm not going to pretend that individual consumer choices will fix systems this deep. But I'm also not going to leave you with nihilism, because some things have worked, some changes have happened, some paths exist. They're difficult, uncertain, and insufficient by themselves, but they're real. So let's talk about what can actually be done at every level, from individual to global, acknowledging honestly how limited each intervention is, but also acknowledging limited change is better than no change. And then we need to talk about what it means to live in this world with this knowledge, because that's ultimately what this has been about from the beginning.
Let me start with the hardest truth. There is no single solution. Anyone who tells you they have the answer to global poverty is either lying or selling something. Probably both. The problem is too complex, too embedded in history and power structures for any one policy or intervention to fix. But that doesn't mean nothing can be done. It means we need to think in terms of marginal improvements, not magical transformations. We need to think in terms of helping millions of people, not saving everyone. We need to think in terms of making the system less unjust, not perfectly just. And we need to be honest about trade-offs, because every intervention has costs as well as benefits. So, let's go through what actually works, starting from the global level and working down to the individual, being brutally honest about limitations and uncertainties along the way. At the global systemic level, the international economic architecture needs fundamental reform. The institutions created after World War II, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, were designed by rich countries to benefit rich countries. They enforce rules that make development harder for poor countries while allowing rich countries to protect and subsidize their own industries. This needs to change, but changing it requires political will from rich countries to accept reforms that might not benefit them in the short term. Is that likely? Honestly, not very. Countries act in their own interests, and rich countries benefit from the current system. But it's not impossible. There have been some reforms. Debt relief programs in the 2000s canceled billions in unpayable debt for the poorest countries. It wasn't enough, and it came with conditions, but it was something. The pushback against structural adjustment programs that forced countries to privatize and cut spending has led to more flexibility in how countries can use loans. There's growing recognition that the Washington Consensus, the free market ideology that dominated development policy for decades, failed in most places. So there's intellectual movement, even if policy change is slow. What would real reform look like? First, poor countries need more policy space to pursue industrial policy, protect infant industries, and require technology transfer, the same strategies that rich countries use to develop. The WTO rules that prevent these strategies should be relaxed for developing countries. Rich countries did these things when they were developing. The rules-based international order should have different rules for countries at different development levels, not one-size-fits-all requirements that happen to benefit whoever's already rich. Second, international trade needs to be fairer. Rich countries subsidize their agriculture with hundreds of billions of dollars, making it impossible for poor countries to compete. Those subsidies should be eliminated, or at minimum, poor countries should be allowed to protect their agricultural sectors without penalty. Third, debt relief needs to be more comprehensive. Many poor countries spend more on debt service than on healthcare and education combined. They're paying interest on loans that often funded corrupt projects or were forced on them by previous dictators.
Those debts should be canceled, not just reduced, especially for the poorest countries. Fourth, tax havens and illicit financial flows need to be shut down. Rich individuals and corporations from poor countries hide trillions of dollars in offshore accounts, money that should be taxed and invested domestically. International cooperation to eliminate tax havens would return massive resources to poor countries. And fifth, immigration restrictions should be eased. If people can't bring opportunities to their countries, they should be able to move to where opportunities exist. Open borders would do more to reduce global poverty than almost any other single policy. The economic evidence on this is overwhelming, but politically it's a non-starter in most rich countries.
Do I think these reforms will happen? Some of them, partially, maybe. Political change is slow and uncertain, but the direction is important. We should be pushing for these systemic changes even if they take decades to achieve, because without changing the global structure, everything else is just treating symptoms. But we can't wait for global reform to help people today. So let's talk about what individual countries can do, because this is where we actually have examples of what works, even if the path is narrow and difficult. Countries that have successfully developed did a few things consistently, and poor countries today should try to replicate these strategies as much as the current global system allows. First, invest massively in education. Not just primary education, though that's essential, but secondary and tertiary education focused on skills the global economy demands. South Korea spent huge percentages of GDP on education and sent students abroad to learn technology and bring it back. China built universities at an unprecedented rate and now produces more STEM graduates than any other country. Education is the one investment that definitely pays off, though it takes a generation to see results. Every study confirms this. Educated populations are healthier, more productive, and better able to demand good governance. But education requires money that poor countries often don't have, which is why international aid focused on education is one of the most effective interventions. Second, build state capacity. This is harder to do, but absolutely essential. Countries need functioning bureaucracies with competent, honest civil servants. This means paying government workers enough that they don't need bribes to survive. It means merit-based hiring and promotion. It means anti-corruption systems with real enforcement. Singapore did this by making government service prestigious and well-paid. China did it through meritocratic exams and performance-based promotion. It's not impossible, but it requires political leaders who are willing to reduce their own power and limit their own corruption, which brings us back to the commitment problem. Third, countries need to build institutions that protect property rights and enforce contracts while also being inclusive rather than extractive. This is the fundamental challenge. Institutions that only protect elite property are extractive. Institutions that protect everyone's property and enforce everyone's contracts are inclusive. The transition from extractive to inclusive institutions usually requires political change, often democratization, but not always. South Korea and Taiwan developed under authoritarian governments that were nevertheless focused on broad-based economic growth rather than just enriching elites. China has maintained authoritarian politics while creating relatively inclusive economic institutions, at least compared to other authoritarian countries. So there's not one political system that guarantees good economic institutions, but there are principles: equality before the law, constraints on executive power, protection of property rights for ordinary people, not just elites, and accountability mechanisms even if they're not democratic elections.
Fourth, industrial policy done right can help countries build industries and move up the value chain. This requires identifying industries where the country could potentially compete, providing support through loans, infrastructure, and protection from foreign competition, demanding performance in exchange for support, measured in exports and productivity, and withdrawing support from failures while doubling down on successes. This is what South Korea, Taiwan, and China did. It's risky because it requires competent government officials making good decisions about which industries to support, and many countries lack that capacity. But it can work if the institutions are right. Fifth, Countries need to fight corruption seriously, not performatively, not just to satisfy international donors, but actually reducing corruption in ways that change incentives. This is incredibly difficult because the people with power to fight corruption are often benefiting from it. But some countries have made progress. Botswana has relatively low corruption because the first president established norms against it, and institutions survived him. Rwanda, under Paul Kagame, has reduced corruption significantly through strict enforcement, though at the cost of political freedom. Singapore is the least corrupt country in Asia because Lee Kuan Yew made anti-corruption a genuine priority with severe penalties. So it can be done, but it requires political leadership that prioritizes long-term development over short-term personal enrichment. Sixth, and this is controversial, but countries should be strategic about integration with the global economy. The advice from international institutions is always to open your markets, remove tariffs, and let foreign competition in. This is good for rich countries that want access to your markets, but it's often bad for poor countries trying to develop industries. The smarter approach is gradual, strategic opening. Protect industries that have potential to grow and compete globally, open sectors where you can't compete anyway, negotiate for technology transfer and local content requirements when you allow foreign investment. Don't just open everything at once and hope for the best. This is what China did brilliantly. They opened special economic zones while keeping the rest of the economy protected. They required joint ventures that transferred technology. They moved gradually and strategically. Vietnam is doing something similar now. They're integrating with the global economy, but on their own terms, protecting key industries while opening others. But all of these strategies require state capacity, political will, and institutions that don't exist in most poor countries. So we're back to the chicken and egg problem. You need good institutions to develop, but you need political stability and resources to build good institutions, and you need development to get political stability and resources. So how do countries break out of this trap? Honestly, most don't. That's the depressing truth. Most poor countries stay poor because the vicious cycles are so powerful. But some countries do break out, and when you look at how, there are a few patterns. Sometimes it's a crisis that breaks the old system and creates space for reform. South Korea's takeoff happened after the devastation of the Korean War destroyed the old feudal elite. Taiwan's development accelerated after being expelled from the UN created urgency. China's reforms started after the disaster of the Cultural Revolution discredited the old system. Crises create political space for change because the old system has clearly failed. Sometimes it's a leader who genuinely prioritizes development and has enough political power to push through reforms. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Park Chung-hee in South Korea, Deng Xiaoping in China, Seretse Khama in Botswana. These weren't perfect people. Some were authoritarians who violated human rights, but they built institutions and pursued policies that enabled development. Good leadership matters enormously, but you can't design systems that depend on finding exceptional leaders. That's just luck.
Sometimes it's external support that provides resources and expertise at a critical moment. South Korea received massive American aid during the Cold War. Taiwan got similar support. This aid was motivated by geopolitics, not altruism, but it helped. Marshall Plan aid helped Europe rebuild after World War II. So foreign aid can work when it's large enough, sustained enough, and doesn't come with destructive conditions. But most aid today is too small, too fragmented, and comes with too many strings attached to have transformative impact. And sometimes countries get lucky with geography, resources that are managed well, or avoiding the worst of colonial extraction. Botswana had diamonds discovered after independence and managed them well. Norway had oil but already had functioning institutions. Luck matters. We don't like to admit it, but luck matters enormously. Some countries get lucky with leadership, timing, and circumstances. Others don't, and that's unjust, but it's reality. So what does this mean for poor countries today? It means the path to development is narrower and harder than it was for countries that developed in the 20th century. The global rules are less favorable, the technological competition is more intense, the environmental constraints are tighter, but the path still exists. Countries can still develop if they build institutions, invest in education, pursue smart industrial policy, fight corruption, and integrate strategically with the global economy. It's not guaranteed, many will try and fail, but it's possible. Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Vietnam are making progress. Bangladesh went from basket case to the second largest garment exporter in the world. Morocco is building an auto industry. These aren't complete success stories yet, but they're countries moving in the right direction. So development is still possible, but it requires everything going right. Good leadership, smart policies, institutional development, strategic economic integration, and luck. That's a high bar. Most countries won't clear it, and that's deeply unjust. Which brings us to the question of international aid and what rich countries should do. Foreign aid is controversial. Critics say it creates dependency, funds corruption, and doesn't lead to development. Defenders say it saves lives, builds infrastructure, and helps countries develop. And they're both right, because aid has done all of those things depending on how it's designed and implemented. Bad aid, which is a lot of aid historically, gets stolen by corrupt governments, funds projects that don't make sense, creates dependency on foreign expertise, and comes with conditions that benefit donor countries more than recipients. But good aid can work. Aid that builds human capital through health and education has clear benefits. Vaccinations, malaria prevention, school construction, teacher training, these save lives and build capacity. Aid that funds infrastructure without absurd conditions can help. Roads, ports, electricity grids, these are necessary for development. Aid that supports good governance and institution building can work if it's done with genuine partnership rather than imposing foreign models. And aid that provides debt relief and budget support for countries with good governance can give them fiscal space to invest in their own priorities.
The problem is that most aid doesn't look like this. Most aid is small-scale, fragmented across hundreds of donor projects, comes with reporting requirements that overwhelm recipient governments, and is designed to meet donor country priorities rather than recipient needs. If rich countries were serious about helping poor countries develop, they would provide large-scale, long-term, flexible funding to countries with decent governance, and let those countries decide how to spend it based on their own priorities. But that requires trust, and donors don't trust recipient governments, often for good reasons given corruption. So we're stuck with a system where aid is too fragmented and conditional to be transformative, but does enough good in health and education that we should keep doing it while trying to reform it. Not a satisfying answer, but an honest one. Now let's talk about what we as individuals can do, because this is what you're really asking. You're not the president of a poor country or the head of the World Bank. You're someone who watched this video and wants to know what you should do with this knowledge. And I'm going to be honest with you. Individual actions are not going to solve structural problems. You buying fair trade coffee is nice, but it's not going to change the global economic system. You donating to charity is generous, but it's not going to break vicious cycles of institutional dysfunction. Individual ethical consumption is not enough. We need to be clear about that. The problems we've discussed are structural, political, and systemic. They require structural, political, and systemic solutions. But that doesn't mean individual actions are meaningless. They're just limited. So here's what you can actually do. First, stay informed and help others understand these issues. The biggest barrier to change is that most people don't understand how global inequality works. They believe the simple wrong answers. Poor countries are poor because people are lazy or corrupt or have bad culture. If you can help people understand the real causes, geography, colonialism, institutions, vicious cycles, then political change becomes more possible. Support politicians and policies that address root causes. Vote for representatives who support foreign aid, debt relief, fair trade, immigration reform, and climate action. These aren't sexy issues. They don't dominate elections, but they matter. If enough people care enough to make them politically salient, change can happen. Advocate for systemic change. Contact representatives. Support organizations pushing for global economic reform. Make noise about issues like tax havens, illicit financial flows, and unfair trade rules. Political change happens when enough people demand it.
Second, be thoughtful about where you spend money and what you support. I said ethical consumption isn't enough, and it's not, but it's also not nothing. Companies respond to consumer pressure. If enough people demand supply chain transparency, living wages for workers, and environmental sustainability, companies will change. Not out of goodness, but because it affects their bottom line.
So support companies that treat workers fairly and are transparent about supply chains. Avoid companies with records of exploitation. Buy less cheap stuff generally because cheap usually means someone somewhere was exploited to make it cheap. This doesn't solve the systemic problem, but it shifts incentives slightly in the right direction. And donate to effective organizations if you have resources to spare. Not all charities are equal. Some waste money on overhead and ineffective programs. Others have strong evidence of impact. Organizations working on health interventions, malaria nets, vaccinations, deworming, education, and direct cash transfers have good evidence of effectiveness. Research where your money will do the most good and donate strategically. It won't change systems, but it will help specific people, and that matters. Third, if you have skills, consider using them to help. If you're a teacher, doctor, engineer, or developer, there are ways to contribute expertise to development projects, not as a savior swooping in to fix things, that's the colonial mindset, but as a partner working with local organizations on their priorities. If you're a researcher, study development issues and contribute to the knowledge base. If you're a writer or communicator, help spread understanding. If you're a programmer, contribute to open source projects that help poor countries. Your skills have value. Think about how to use them for something beyond your own advancement. And if you're early in your career, consider working in development, not for an international NGO imposing solutions, but for organizations led by people from the countries they're trying to help. Organizations focused on institution building, education, health, or governance. Development work is hard, often frustrating, and you won't save the world, but you might help some people in some places, and that's worthwhile. Fourth, examine your own life and complicity. This is the uncomfortable part. If you live in a rich country, your comfortable life is connected to systems that keep other countries poor. The cheap electronics you use have cobalt mined by children. The cheap clothes you wear were made in factories with terrible conditions. The coffee you drink was picked by people making poverty wages. You didn't personally create these systems, you weren't alive when they were built, but you benefit from them, and that means you have a responsibility to understand them and push for change. This doesn't mean you should feel guilty every moment of every day. Guilt without action is just self-indulgence. But it does mean you should feel some discomfort. That discomfort should motivate you to learn more, do more, and demand more from the systems you participate in. And fifth, live differently. Not in some performative way where you post about it on social media, but in a real way where your values actually shape your choices. If you understand that global inequality is unjust and structural, then maybe you don't need the newest phone every year. Maybe you can buy less, waste less, and share more. Maybe you can prioritize experiences and relationships over consumption. Maybe you can resist the cultural pressure to always want more, buy more, have more. Because that pressure, the consumerist culture that says happiness comes from stuff, that culture drives the extraction economy that exploits people in poor countries. If enough people opted out, even partially, it would shift demand and change incentives. Not enough to fix everything, but enough to matter on the margins. But here's what I really want to say about individual action. Don't let it be a substitute for political action. Corporations and politicians love when people think that individual consumer choices are the solution, because it lets them off the hook. Just buy our ethical product and you've done your part. No, your part includes political engagement, demanding systemic change, and holding power accountable. Individual actions are necessary but not sufficient. We need both individual ethics and political change. We need to live according to our values while also fighting to change the systems that make it hard to live according to our values.
Now let me address something you might be thinking. This all sounds nice, but nothing's really going to change. The rich countries won't reform the global system because they benefit from it. Poor countries are trapped in vicious cycles. Individuals can't do much. So why should I care? And that's a fair question. If nothing can really change, why not just accept the world as it is, enjoy your own life, and not worry about problems you can't solve? And I don't have a perfect argument against that. I can't prove to you that your caring and actions will definitely lead to change. I can't promise that if we all try hard enough, we'll fix global inequality. That would be dishonest. The problems are enormous. The obstacles are real. Many poor countries will stay poor. Many people will suffer. And your individual impact will be small. Those are facts. But here's what I believe, and you can disagree, but I'm going to be honest about it. We have a moral obligation to try, even when success isn't guaranteed. If you understand that billions of people are poor because of unjust systems, and you benefit from those systems, then you have a responsibility to work toward changing them, even if your individual contribution is small. Not because it will definitely succeed, but because it's the right thing to do. Because the alternative, accepting injustice and doing nothing, is morally unacceptable. And here's the thing about systemic change. It's unpredictable. Throughout history, systems that seemed permanent collapsed suddenly. Slavery seemed permanent until it didn't. Colonialism seemed permanent until it didn't. The Soviet Union seemed permanent until it didn't. We can't predict when or how the current global economic system will change, but we can be confident it will change eventually because all systems do. And when it changes, what comes next depends on the intellectual, political, and moral groundwork that people laid beforehand. The abolition of slavery happened because people spent decades arguing it was wrong and building movements even when success seemed impossible. Decolonization happened because people fought for independence, even when empires seemed invincible. The next transformation of the global economic system will happen because people now are arguing for justice, building alternatives, and refusing to accept the status quo as permanent. You might not see the results in your lifetime, but your efforts contribute to possibilities for future change. That's not nothing. That's how history works. So what does it mean to live in a world structured by these systems? It means recognizing that where you were born determined most of your life chances. It means understanding that your comfort likely connects to someone else's exploitation. It means knowing that hard work isn't equally rewarded everywhere because institutions and systems matter more than individual effort. It means accepting that the world is unjust in deep structural ways that won't be fixed easily or quickly. But it also means recognizing that injustice isn't natural or inevitable. It's the result of human choices, which means different human choices could create different outcomes. The world we have isn't the only world possible, and living with that knowledge means being humble about your own accomplishments, because if you're successful, geography, institutions, and luck played a larger role than you probably want to admit. It means being generous toward people who haven't had your advantages, because their circumstances, not their character, explain most of why they're where they are. It means being skeptical of anyone who tells you the world is a meritocracy, because it's not, and pretending it is serves the interests of people who benefit from the current system. And it means being willing to sacrifice some of your comfort for the possibility of a more just world, because that's what justice sometimes requires.
This is the deeper problem I've been circling around for 5 chapters. The surface problem is understanding why some countries are rich and others poor. And now you understand. It's geography giving some regions head starts, it's colonialism building extraction systems that still function, it's institutions determining which countries are in virtuous cycles and which are in vicious cycles. It's path dependency, making change incredibly difficult. It's a global economic system designed to benefit rich countries at the expense of poor ones. You get it now. But the deeper problem is what you do with that understanding. Do you integrate it into how you see the world and live your life? Or do you watch this video, feel informed for a while, and then go back to living exactly as you did before? Because that's the real test, not whether you learned the facts, but whether the facts changed you. And I can't tell you what that should look like for you specifically. Everyone's situation is different. Everyone has different resources, constraints, and opportunities. But I can tell you what it looks like for me. I make videos about development, inequality, and systems because I think understanding matters. I donate a portion of income to organizations with evidence of impact. I vote for politicians who support foreign aid and fair trade, even though those aren't popular positions. I try to buy less and waste less, though I fail at this more than I succeed. I talk about these issues with people even when it's uncomfortable, and I try to create work that helps people see the world more clearly, even when clarity is painful.
That's not enough. I know it's not enough. The problems are too big for individual actions to solve. But it's what I can do, and doing something insufficient is better than doing nothing while knowing everything. So here's what I want you to take from these 5 chapters. The world is unjust in ways that are structural, historical, and ongoing. Global inequality isn't natural or deserved. It's the result of systems built over centuries that concentrate wealth in some places and extract it from others. Most poor countries are stuck in vicious cycles that are incredibly difficult to escape. The development strategies that worked for rich countries aren't available to poor countries anymore because global rules changed. Individual actions matter but aren't enough. We need systemic change, which requires political will that currently doesn't exist. But systems do change, unpredictably and suddenly, when enough people understand they're unjust and push for alternatives. You now understand. The question is what you'll do with that understanding. And I'm not going to tell you the answer because there isn't one answer. But I am going to tell you that ignorance is no longer an option. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you know. The map has changed, and that demands something from you.
Where do we go from here? I don't know. I genuinely don't know if global inequality will get better or worse over the next century. I don't know if poor countries will find paths to development or stay trapped. I don't know if rich countries will reform the global system or defend their advantages. I don't know if technology will close gaps or widen them. I don't know if climate change will hit poor countries hardest, which it will, and whether rich countries will help, which they should. There's so much uncertainty. But uncertainty isn't an excuse for inaction. It's a reason for humility, for trying things and learning from failures, for building knowledge and movements even when outcomes are unclear. The future isn't written. It depends on choices we make collectively and individually, and those choices depend on understanding, which is why I made this video. Not to give you answers, because I don't have all the answers, but to give you understanding, which is the foundation for better questions and better choices. So we're at the end of the journey. We started with these simple wrong answers. Poor countries are poor because people are lazy, or it's culture, or it's geography, or it's resources. We rejected those answers and went deeper. We explored geography's role in giving some regions advantages. We examined colonialism's creation of extraction systems. We analyzed institutions and why they matter more than anything else. We traced vicious cycles that trap countries in poverty. We looked at the few countries that escaped and how they did it. We confronted the crisis that systems are self-reinforcing and incredibly resistant to change. And we arrived here, at the recognition that the problem is vast but not unsolvable, that individual actions matter but aren't sufficient, that we need systemic change but can't wait for it to help people today, and that living with this knowledge requires something from us, even if we're not sure exactly what. This is where the transformation happens. You're not the same person who started this video. You can't be, because you've seen how the world actually works, and you can't unsee it. The status quo, the normal world map where some countries are rich and others are poor, that's not normal anymore. It's a historical artifact, a power structure, a system that serves some interests at the expense of others. And now you know that, which means the new status quo, your new normal, has to include that knowledge. How you integrate it is up to you, but it has to be integrated. Otherwise, these 5 chapters were just entertainment, just information consumed and forgotten. And I don't think that's what you want. I think you watched this far because you want to understand, and understanding demands change. So I'll end where I began, with honesty. I don't have a secret 5-step formula for ending global poverty. I don't have manipulation techniques to make you feel good about complex problems. What I have is a commitment to showing things as they actually are, even when the truth is uncomfortable, and trusting that understanding is valuable even when it's painful. Because the alternative, comfortable ignorance or simple wrong answers, that's what got us here. That's what maintains the systems that keep billions of people poor, and I won't participate in that. I'll choose the harder path of truth over the easier path of comforting lies. Even if it hurts retention, even if it costs views, even if people click off because it's too complex or too depressing.
because some things matter more than metrics. Some things matter more than going viral, like actually understanding the world we live in, like recognizing injustice, like choosing to do something about it even when success isn't guaranteed. And maybe that's the real answer to why some countries are rich and others aren't. It's not one thing, it's everything. Geography, history, institutions, power, luck, and choices compounding over centuries into the unequal world we inhabit today. A world that didn't have to be this way and doesn't have to stay this way. A world that will change eventually, unpredictably, into something different. And what that something becomes depends on people who understand how we got here and refuse to accept it as permanent. People like you, if you choose to be. That's not a satisfying ending. It's not inspiring in the traditional sense, but it's true. And truth is what I promised you, so that's what you get. Thank you for spending 2 hours with me on this. I know it wasn't easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. Now go do something with what you know, whatever that means for you. Just don't do nothing. The world doesn't need more people who understand everything and do nothing. It needs people who understand enough and do something, even when that something feels insufficient. Because insufficient action multiplied across millions of people might just be enough. Or it might not, but we have to try. That's the treasure from this journey. Not a solution, but a responsibility. Not an answer, but a question. What kind of world do you want to live in, and what are you willing to get there? I can't answer that for you. Only you can. But now you have the knowledge to answer it honestly, and that matters more than you might think. Welcome to your new status quo. The cycle continues, but you're different now. Where you go from here is up to you.